Thank you for joining us, everyone. We will begin in 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Making Great Decisions. My name is Greg Farabee, and I'm the Client Relations Manager for Kent State's Center for Corporate and Professional Development. Our center specializes in providing employee development for clients in Northeast Ohio and around the country. We offer training as public open enrollment programs delivered in Independence, Ohio, as well as on-site customized programs delivered at your location. I'm joined today by Kent State facilitator Bob Jewell. I will be serving as your host, and Bob will be our presenter for today. Bob has over 36 years of hands-on experience managing and consulting on engineering, operational, and strategic projects. Bob's practical experience has allowed him to develop and fine-tune an excellent process for helping others learn the valuable skills of decision-making. His work has earned the trust of clients such as Toyota, General Electric, Federal Express, Lubrizol, and the Sherwin-Williams Company. Bob joined our center in 2002. Everyone in attendance today has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 200 registered participants. Despite having everyone on mute, we do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions in writing using the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present questions to Bob as time permits throughout the webinar. We are recording today's webinar, and at conclusion, you will receive an email link to allow you to view the entire webinar. Without further ado, I will now pass the microphone to Bob Joel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I guess we're starting off with a polling question, Greg. I thought if we start off by just giving us a definition of a decision and a little background. This was a class that I actually put together for MBA students down at Xavier University a few years ago, and as part of the MBA program. And so today we're going to do an hour of a one-day class of a semester class. So try to hit the highlights for you. I always like to start off the class with a definition of what is a decision. It's a choice that you or with the help of others make about something that results in a course of action taken. And we'll come back and take a look at this a little bit later. But in the programs that I've done with people like General Electric, they've always put an emphasis on how important decision making is in their organization and that they want their people to become great decision makers. The problem is most of us have never even attended a class on decision making. And here's an element that's so important to not only your professional career, but to the organization. I remember years ago when I was doing this class, the CEO of the company introduced it as our company is only as good as the decisions our people make. So I think it's an important skill. And I think whenever you're working with managers or supervisors or even up at the executive level, it's a topic that needs to be put on the table and discussed. So I guess we're getting results from our poll question.
And looks like you're getting a relatively even split, Bob, but we're on the side of no.
Good. Well, it's often a question I ask in class, how many people have ever been to a class on decision making, and usually it's very few hands that go up during the class. What I wanted to start off with was just talk a little bit about how the human brain plays into decision making, because it can be very helpful, and on the other hand, it can be very harmful. So just to make that simple, generally I break the human brain into two systems. What is called system one, that's the part of our brain that's on all the time. It's a very automatic, quick, doesn't require much effort. It's very intuitive, very impulsive. The fourth bullet, you can see conclusions first, then arguments. That's something we got to look out for in decision making. And system one is that system that takes over in emergencies when you see a car coming at you and you go for the brakes or go for the steering wheel. But this is a system of our brain that's on all the time. And then the second part of our brain is system two. I try to stay away from all the anatomy terms here and just make it simple with system one and system two. And you'll see that it's actually the opposite of system one. It's very controlled and slow. It demands effort. It's very logical and analytical versus intuitive and emotional. It's very capable of deliberate choices, and it takes over when system one doesn't have an answer. The problem is system one's on all the time when we make decisions, and that can lead us into some traps that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. But system one seldom doesn't have an answer. So when we're looking at great decisions, what we're going to do is focus on how can I involve both system one and system two in my decision making? Because what we find out is you're going to make better decisions if system one and system two are both involved. Now, if you're in obviously a life or death situation, System 1 takes over, and we're kind of glad it does. And we don't need to sit down and have an analytical and logical discussion about possibly a life or death situation. But in the decisions we make in our careers, the decisions we make in our companies, both operational decisions, strategic decisions, decisions about who we're going to hire, decisions about what products we're going to be in, how we're going to market, promote those products. I mean, if you think of it for a minute, a company really is just the sum of the decisions it makes. So one of the tricks in great decision making is how do we get System 2 involved? Because there's a lot of pitfalls that we can run into if we're only using System 1. I think we have another polling question, Greg.
So as you take a look, do you clarify what you're trying to achieve before you make your decisions? And it looks like, Bob, we have a lot of committed individuals. Over 80% do.
That's excellent, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a few seconds. But first, I wanted to go over some common traps that people fall into in decision making, and you'll notice that a lot of these go back to the System 1, System 2 thinking. So for instance, one that's very common and much has been written about this is confirmation bias, and that's where we develop a quick belief about a situation, and then our mind starts to seek information that confirms that belief. Well, hopefully you can see System 1 thinking all over that. The word quick, the fact that the brain's going to only confirm what it first came up with, so it doesn't look at, say, 180 degrees opposite. Very common trap, probably the most common in decision making. Emotions always get involved, and again, System 1, very emotional part of the human brain, and emotions are good in decision making, but they can often lead us down wrong path. Second most common is overconfidence, or what some people call the overconfidence bias. Some people may know this as the Kruger-Dunning effect. We think we know more than we do about how the future will unfold or about our knowledge on a subject. And this is very pervasive in organizations. Again, a lot of System 1 in this. System 1 sees patterns. It tends to extend those patterns out, even though we don't have the evidence that those patterns are strong. The fourth one I wanted to mention today is anchoring, where we give disproportionate weight to the first information you receive. Again, you can almost see System 1 in this too. System 1 tends to be very quick. It's not analytical, so the first information that it receives in. The example that I always like to use in the class on anchoring is if you ever grew up with siblings and while you were growing up got into a spat with your sibling, there was always a race to see which sibling could get to the parent first and tell the story first. And we learned that at a very young age. And believe it or not, bring that into our lives much later as adults. But it's that belief that if I can get my story out first, it's going to, for some reason, get more belief than the second story that's told. So anchoring's a trap. There's a great article in Harvard Business Review written a few years ago on 10 hidden traps that are involved in decision making. We cover 6 of them in the class, and the 2, confirmation bias and overconfidence, tend to be prevailing. So we've got to think about this and be aware of these traps. So the big question comes, how do we avoid them? These traps that so often catch us. And with MBA students, I would always share some great stories that probably some of you are familiar with. One of them that I share in the class is, when Reed Hastings, who's the president and CEO of Netflix, went to Dallas and offered to sell Netflix to Blockbuster, and met with their board, and their executives basically laughed him out of the room and said, why would we be interested in buying you? You don't even own any stores. And we all know the story today. Netflix is worth billions and Blockbuster's out of business. So there's the overconfidence bias coming into play. I mean, there's Blockbuster thinking, we know how the future is going to unfold. Look how successful we've been. We can continue to be this successful. And Reed Hastings at Netflix is saying, no, there's a different future out there. And if you don't see it, we could partner up and be part of it together if you don't see it. So I give lots of examples like that in the class where people can actually see, and these are people that are generally considered pretty sharp people. If you're running Blockbuster, you're usually pretty sharp individual, and even sharp individuals can be hindered by some of these traps. So let's talk about some ways to avoid them. One of the ways is use the concept of a spotlight. What's in the spotlight when you make a decision is rarely everything you need to make a great decision. So if you're only going to keep your spotlight pointed in one place, it's going to create problems. You can almost see System 1 wants to keep that spotlight in one place. System 2 would love to see that spotlight move because it's going to take in more information, but that's going to require analysis, and System 1 doesn't like to analyze. So if you can just move a spotlight, and one of the great ways to move a spotlight is simply involve other people in the decision. Ask them what they think. Ask them how they see. I mean, we all have close friends that we go to when we need to make difficult decisions, and one of the things we value in a friend is that they will sometimes shed some light on a decision we're making that we haven't thought about, oftentimes because of our own bias. So that's one technique to avoid trap, is try to engage more people, and that will automatically engage System 2 and result in things being a little bit more analytical versus emotional and intuitive. There's some other ways to avoid these traps too. And one of them is to have a decision-making process. So one of our poll questions is, how many of you actually have a decision-making process?
All right. Looks like, not surprisingly, the people that signed up for a webinar on great decision making, those people are, the majority of them do not have a formal decision making process.
I should mention that we're going to rule out horoscopes and lucky rabbit's foots and four-leaf clovers as a legitimate decision-making process in this discussion. So I wanted to share with you some criteria. I've seen a number of really great decision-making processes that companies use. General Electric uses one. Toyota's very big in having a decision-making process that they train their people around. This basic criteria that I look for in a great decision-making process is, obviously it's got to be able to filter out a lot of noise and put a focus on what's important. Number two, it's got to be logical and consistent, meaning you can apply it to a lot of different types of decisions. Consistent meaning over time it tends to yield better results. Three, here's a great example of it blends analytical with intuitive thinking. This is really, it blends System 1 with System 2, or to switch that around, analytical is System 2, intuitive System 1. So you're now seeing the second tool that can help us avoid a lot of the decision-making traps, and that has a good process that blends both analytical and intuitive. And I in no way want to infer that we're leaving out intuitive in the decision-making process. And a lot of people, when they hear process, think, wow, you've gone all the way over to System 2. No, we definitely want intuitive thinking involved. Your life experiences, your experiences at the company you work for, your experiences with the people that are going to be involved in decisions is very valuable, and we definitely need to factor that in. Four, it encourages and guides the gathering of relevant information and informed opinion. Again, almost like number one, there's a lot of noise in decision-making that we have to be aware of, and a good process will give us some ways to filter out and make sure we're looking at the right information. Especially in the age of the internet and Google and Wikipedia, we can overwhelm ourselves with information so quickly that can actually slow down the decision-making process. And we see this in a lot of organizations where, with all the information that's available these days, it can slow the decision-making process down to the extent that it's almost a stall in the process. Five, I believe a good decision-making process should be straightforward, reliable, easy to use, and flexible. It shouldn't be complicated. It shouldn't be calculus. It shouldn't be physics. It should be just a straightforward, reliable, easy to use, flexible, meaning you can use it in a lot of different circumstances. You can modify it as you need to. One of the interesting things I ask in the class is how many people are in positions where you have to sell decisions you make to other people? And if you're in any type of a leadership role, be it a frontline supervisor out on the shop floor or a mid-level manager, you have to sell decisions you make to people above you, to people that work for you, and sometimes even people that are your peers. And it's very much easier to sell a decision if you can walk people through the process. And I know back in my corporate days when I interviewed people for key positions in companies, one of my key interview questions was, do you have a process for making decisions, and could you walk me through an example of how you use that process? I mean, bottom line is, in interviews, I was looking for good decision makers. We can give them a lot of other skills, but decision-making skills are kind of hard. And if you can find those in the people you're interviewing, it's very helpful. So here's a process that I base the class on. And a lot of people, we start off with this blank picture and we kind of discuss what are the different steps in the decision-making process. So I just thought I'd throw this out. It's not a poll question, but you can be thinking about this. What do you think are some of the steps in a great decision-making process? Some of the answers I've heard in class are like identify a scapegoat, which I don't think shows up in a good decision-making process. Identify who's going to take the blame if it doesn't go well. Obviously not a very good step in the decision-making process. The other thing I want to emphasize is I don't consider all decision-making to be problem-solving. And a lot of people, even though the two processes can be very similar at times, I don't necessarily view every decision as we have a problem, therefore we have to make a decision. Obviously, a lot of decisions we make resolve or revolve around problems that are occurring in the business, a marketing program that's not going well, or product that's not doing well, or service that's not doing well. But I don't put the emphasis on decision making as always about problem solving. So let's walk through some of the steps. Step one is define the question. Some people in a problem solving situation may say define the problem, but what's the question we're trying to answer? If you think about at the root of decision making, there's got to be a question. And often it surprises me how many people are not on the same page as to what the question is, which means we're not even all starting from the same place. And I think in any legitimate decision-making process, you've got to start by defining what the question is. There's going to be a step 2 and a 1.5, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. Step 2 is a surprising step, and not a lot of people in the class get this step, but we actually alluded to it earlier. What are you trying to achieve by answering that question? And this goes back to just really basic Stephen Covey things. Begin with the end in mind. What are you trying to achieve by answering the question? A lot of people, after they define the question, want to jump right into giving me answers or coming up with answers. But I need a big filter in front of those answers, and that filter is going to be, what are we trying to achieve by answering the question? We'll look at some short-term things that we want to achieve, and most every decision we make also has long-term implications, so we'll also consider, are there any long-term objectives that we're trying to achieve? Our goal here is to come up with maybe 2 or 3, no more than 5 or 6. If we've got more than 5 or 6, we've probably got a way too big question up in step 1, well, world hunger or world peace type question that we want to try to avoid. So as you'll see, we walk through these steps. Each step kind of builds on the previous step and almost in a way polices the previous step. So again, if you're coming up with way more than 6 or 7 objectives, that's an indication your question's too big and you probably ought to work to narrow it down. We'll come back to step 1.5 in a minute. The next logical step in the process would be, let's generate some possible answers now. We know what the question is. We know what the objectives are. Now we're in a position to come up with answers to the question, but those answers have to align with the objectives. Step 1 and 2, by the way, in most great decision-making processes are referred to as framing the decision. And any literature that you read or books that you read on decision-making are always going to put an emphasis on, it's very important to frame the decision well and make sure that there's a good framing of the decision. So step 1, step 2 are going to represent the frame. And then step 3, generate answers. And here we can use a multitude of techniques, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Step 4, it's time to make the decision. Evaluate the answers and make a decision. That could be some risk analysis, financial analysis, return on investment analysis. It could be a number of different techniques that we can use there to do the evaluation. Now, one of the things I want you to notice right away is there's more than 4 steps. I don't think too many of you would be surprised by how many people believe that once the decision's made, the decision's over. But I want to take you back to the definition I gave you of a decision earlier, where it said a choice that you make yourself or with the help of others. But notice we didn't end that definition there. The definition went on to say that results in a course of action taken. So I believe in any good decision-making process, you've got to include the implementation of your decision. And often this is a tough part of the decision-making. Make the decision, but I'm sure all of us listening in, participating today, know that we've seen a great decision go south during implementation. So we've got to think about how we're going to implement this decision. What's our action plan? Who needs to be involved? And at that point, we can start setting up a time frame of how long it's going to take to implement the decision. Some of them can be implemented very quickly. Some of them are going to have a number of activities that have to get involved. And then I think the final step is usually pretty obvious of the decision-making process, is we want to assess the results. And all we're going to do in step 6 is refer back to step 2. And in step 2, we're going to set up metrics to make sure that we have a way to measure those objectives, even though some of them may be quantifiable and some may be qualifiable. We're going to establish those metrics in step 2, and then all we're going to do in 6 is come back and verify if those metrics are being met. And I think right here in these 6 steps, you have a very sound, very logical decision-making process. But some of you are probably thinking, but wait a minute, he told me that we weren't going to rule out intuition, and I don't see intuition anywhere in those steps. Well, actually, your intuition comes into play in every one of those steps. We want your intuition involved in defining the question. We want your intuition involved in your experience. That's what intuition is. It comes from your experience. Specifying objectives, doing risk analysis in step 4, putting an action plan together in step 5. You know, one of the things I see a lot as a consultant and is organizations make decisions that, for the sake of a better word, they don't have the horses to make the decision happen. The skills in their people, the systems in place, and that's a decision that's doomed to fail. You've got to consider that when you start considering answers in step 4 and moving into step 5. Do I have the skill set? Do I have the people? Do I have the systems to implement this decision? Because simply the fact that it's made, very seldom you jump 5 and go directly to 6, or you go directly to I've achieved the results in step 2. One other quick note I wanted to make about this process. In the work that's been done by 2 guys that have probably studied decision-making more than anybody in organizations, which is a fellow named Dr. Nutt out of Ohio State University, who's since retired and I think is in an emeritus mode down there, and then Dr. Victor Vroom out of Yale, who in his 90s is still actively teaching classes at Yale. In their work, step 2 is the step most often missed, which is really interesting. And this is a question I ask in class: of these steps, which step do you think most often missed? And it's interesting that it's 2, because look at the connection between 2 and 6. And there's been debates about why people skip step 2, or maybe they don't know to do it. I will admit I take kind of a pessimistic view on this. I think if you skip step 2, you can't do 6. There's no way to evaluate your decision. So you can basically come up with any answer when it comes time to evaluate and say your decision was successful, because nobody established a goal line at step 2. What are we trying to achieve? So I put a lot of emphasis on step 2. In my personal opinion, 1 and 2 are the most important steps in a decision. If you haven't framed the decision well, you're off to a bad start, and 3 through 6 aren't going to pull you out. I know back in my corporate days, when I was asked to make decisions after I framed the decision, I would also often go back to my manager and say, before I move any further forward on this decision, let's make sure both of us are in agreement with how I framed it. What's the question and what are we trying to achieve? Once you're there, usually moving down into the subsequent steps, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 generally go well. But in about Dr. Nutt's research indicates in some 300 to 600 decisions he studied, 85% of the decisions he saw no evidence that anybody had specified. What is it that you want to achieve? So I tell people, if you want to be a great decision maker, do step 1 and step 2. You'll find most people are jumping right down to the answers, assuming everybody knows what the question is and assuming everybody knows what we're trying to achieve. And that's a very, very poor assumption in today's work environment. I think we've got another poll question, Greg.
So do you believe the person that's most impacted by the decision should make the decision? And the tally is coming in, Bob, and it's very overwhelmingly no. Most people do not believe that the person most impacted by the decision should be involved in the decision.
Well, as you can imagine, that would be a great discussion in the classroom if we had everybody in the same spot. I mentioned to you when I was going through the 6 steps that there is a step between 1 and 2. And that's a very important step. And the step between 1 and 2 is who's going to make the decision. And I find that this isn't a conversation that's had much in our corporate environments, that it's not. It's usually thought it is the person that's in charge is going to make the decision. Having spent a lot of time around Toyota, one of the things I've picked up that I've really admired about Toyota's culture is they tend to push decisions down to the people that are impacted by them. because the belief there in their culture is that if you have to live with the consequences of the decision, you'll probably make the better decision. And all of us have been in situations where we watch people make a decision that impacts us, probably in a negative way, and the person that made the decision never had to live with the consequences, and all the rest of us did. So this is something I put a lot of emphasis in the class, because I think it's very important to talk about who's going to make the decision. We don't make that decision within the decision-making process until after step one is done. This is the work of Dr. Victor Vroom out of Yale University, who's done just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of classes with, I think last tally was up to 55,000 managers he's had a chance to work with. So it's very practical, even though it's Yale University, it's very practical data. And what he found is that there's 4 decision-making styles that we should look at. And I think I have those here somewhere. Well, I don't see them on my slide, so I'll share with them what they are. The first one is authoritative. Now that sounds rough, but authoritative just means one person's going to make the decision, and they're not going to have any input. And generally that would be the person in charge. The second style of decision making is consultative. And that's where one person's going to make the decision, but they're going to consult with some other people before they do. By the way, just a quick reference back to our hidden traps for a minute. One of the greatest ways to avoid some of those hidden traps is to get other people involved. So you can imagine if you use an authoritative style a lot, you're probably going to be more likely to fall into some of the traps of decision making. The third style is participative. And this is an interesting style because a lot of people think it means there's a group making the decision, but in reality, no, there's still one person making it. But instead of getting input in a consultative way, which is more one-on-one, they're going to have a group of people in the room, probably the group of people that's going to be impacted by the decision are the people that have to implement it, and they're going to get input from a group. And I think all of you can appreciate that the dynamic of getting input from a group would be different than getting the dynamic of getting input from individuals. So in the first 3 styles, authoritative, consultative, participative, one person makes the decision, but in 2 of those styles, they're engaging other people in the decision-making process. And then the 4th style is consensus. And this is always fun in class because I love to ask people what consensus is. And it's surprising how many people believe that consensus is a vote, meaning that if there's 10 people in the room and we took a vote and it was 8-2, we've made the decision. Well, actually, consensus isn't a vote. Consensus is that there's 10 people in the room, all 10 people have to agree with the decision. We may take a straw vote to find out where everybody in that room is, but if we're using the consensus style, everybody in that room has to support the decision. So it is, in fact, the group making the decision at that point, but not making it by vote. That would be what I call a democratic style. And generally, that's not a good style in decision making. One of the reasons democratic's not a good style is if you take a vote, you end up having winners and losers. And remember, we still have to implement the decision. And generally, the people that didn't like the decision don't show up when it's time to implement it. Or if they do show up, they bring a big monkey wrench to throw into the decision. So the 4 styles we discuss in the class are authoritative, participative, consultative, and consensus. And of course, 3 of those styles have more than one person involved. But there are appropriate times to make authoritative decisions. And we walk through Dr. Vroom's model to discuss that. He's come up with 7 factors that you consider. You hold your step 1 decision question up against those 7 factors. And based on how you answer against the question against those factors, the model will tell you what's the most appropriate style to use. His model actually includes delegate. It may be appropriate to delegate a decision. And, it's interesting discussion. Delegate and abdicate are not the same thing. Abdicate is I don't want this decision in my hand. It's a hot potato. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about it may be better to delegate this decision to somebody else. They may have more information. I believe they may be more impacted by the decision. They may be in a better position to have to live with the consequences. So we talk a little bit about democratic, but in general, I wouldn't recommend democratic decision making in an organization. It's either going to be authoritative one person makes it, notice that 3 of those 4 styles, one person makes the decision. But also notice that in 3 of those 4 styles, more than one person's involved. And that certainly helps us with the style 1, style 2 concerns and avoiding some of the hidden traps involved in decision making. So in terms of how you determine who makes the decision, the Vroom model works really well there. And of course, the styles, if you move into consultative mode or participative mode, generally the decision maker decides who should be in the room, who should I engage one-on-one if I'm using consultative, or who should I bring in the room. And, you know, I've even seen a tendency to bring people in their room or consult with people that you think are going to see things your way. But remember, we talked about the spotlight. Seldom what's in your spotlight is everything you need to see. It's good to get some other people who don't always agree with you input in a decision, because it's amazing how they can shine a light in an area that you're not thinking about, or point out where you may have a bias that's helpful in decision making. I don't believe it should always be the person in charge. A lot of organizations do this, but you know, from my experience around Toyota, I see a lot of great decisions made when decisions are pushed down to the people that are going to be most impacted by the decision. The struggle there is you got to make sure those people are trained on how to make decisions and taught how to make decisions. Again, if they start pulling out rabbit's foots or horoscopes at that point, not a good idea. The other thing I want to talk about back in the steps of the model for a minute is, so step 1 is define the question. Step 1.5 is make the decision, who's going to make the decision. So let's just say for the discussion of the time we have together that the Vroom model said a participative style would be good. So we've got one person making a decision, but they're going to engage a group of people. And at this point in step 2, as we enter step 2, we identify those people and we start to engage them. So step 2, specify objectives, would be done with that group. Here's what I hear from a lot of managers. Geez, Bob, if I had to use participative, I wouldn't know what to do next. And I think, again, if you have a good process, the process tells you what to do next. Get those people in a room and help share with them the question and have them help you specify objectives. You may even want them to look at the question and tell you if they agree with the question, but definitely want their engagement in helping specify the objectives. You can always throw in some strategic things if you have a bigger view of the decision than maybe some of the people in the room have. But at that point, your job is to kind of do some listening and let those people share based on the question that's on the table. What do you think are some good objectives? Again, it's amazing how when those people come in the room, they're going to want to step right into step 3. They're going to think, oh, here's the question. I guess you brought me in here to give you answers. And you're going to have to hold them back and say, no, not ready for answers yet. I really like to know what we're trying to achieve by answering this question. And then our next step would be to move in to generate possible answers. Sometimes you can accomplish step 2 and step 3 actually in the very same meeting. The other thing we cover in the class is we talk a little bit about taking a look at cause and effect relationships between some of the objectives in step 2, because we may have to prioritize those objectives. We may not have time to achieve all of them, but any good decision-making process is going to focus on root cause analysis and try to get to the root and solve the root. Now, sometimes the root is expensive. Sometimes the root takes more time. Sometimes we have to put duct tape on things. But we should at least be able to acknowledge that we've duct taped something because we don't have the time or the money or the resources to get down to the root cause. And of course, if we've duct taped it, most likely it's at some point that duct tape is going to fall off and we're going to be looking back at this decision again. And a lot of people in the class share stories about how, they'll sit in a meeting 4 months after the decision's been made and find the decision's right back on the table again. And they'll say things like, well, I thought we made this decision 4 months ago. Why is it back on the table again? And the answer is probably because the duct tape's fallen off and we didn't get to the root cause, and we patched it, but we need to go back and look at that. So I'd like, coming out of step 2, to know where potential root cause is. And if we don't have time to fix it, then acknowledge that when we go in the answers in step 3, we're going to be doing a little duct taping. Greg, any comments coming in as we're...
Not so far, but we would certainly encourage anyone, if you have questions, again, please submit those on the right side on the control panel, and we'll pass those along to Bob for a response.
Step 3 is where we get to generate answers. And of course, we now have a criteria in front of us. We have the question and we have the objectives. typically what I'll do in a corporate setting is just put the objectives up on flip charts. So if there's 3 different objectives, we'll have a flip chart for each objective. I still have the people in the room who I've invited to be part of this. We're making the assumption right now we're using a participative style. And I'll just have those people, for the sake of a better word, brainstorm possible answers to the objectives that are sitting at the top of the flip charts. And hopefully we've put some metrics and time frames on those objectives, because that will certainly gear up some of the answers. There's maybe some answers we can't do because of the time frames involved that we're trying to achieve in meeting the objectives. So step 3 is really a fun time. Pull out the Post-it notes, get people to write down possible answers, put them up on the flip charts, discuss them. You can facilitate that with a pretty large group, and even there's online tools now that allow you to do that, even if you can't get everybody in the same room, if they're across time zones or across different locations in the United States. I've seen this done a number of times at different companies I've had a chance to work with, and it works really well. The good news is that when we get to step 3, we've got a good filter in place with step 2 objectives. So really the only answers that we're looking for are answers that are relevant to the objectives that we've established in step 3. And that keeps a lot of noise out of the decision-making process. So that's what step 3 is: generate possible answers.
All right, Bob, we did get a question, and it's in regards to how do you try to get people to make a consensus when perhaps the leader or the manager has their own feelings and doesn't necessarily want to accept the input of the group?
Great question. Consensus is very hard, especially in our culture. The culture of the United States is we like to have one person that's kind of the person responsible for a decision, and one person to point the finger at, so to speak, if the decision doesn't go well. For consensus to work, there really has to be a feeling that there's no titles in this room. We're all in this boat together, and we either sink in this boat together or we make it to shore in this boat together. And that's easier said than done, because egos come to play and titles come to play. And I think those things that you mentioned in your question make consensus very hard. Any good leader that's going to use a participative, a consultative style, and again, in that situation, they would be making a decision, or decide that consensus style is the best style, is going to have to literally put on their listening ears and shut up. And because the minute they speak up into the process, they either give away how they're feeling, they give away their bias, and that's what makes consensus hard. It's hard for a leader to sit back and turn over a decision to a group of people and know that whatever that group of people decides to go with is what we're going to go with. So it's a very tough style to use in a culture like an American culture, where we usually like to, like I said, point our finger at one person at the end of the day and say either the success or failure of that decision was you, and generally that's done by title. So consensus is hard. I think you can also use some techniques. I'm a big fan of brainstorming, but I call it brain writing, where we get Post-it notes out. We give everybody the same color Post-it note. If necessary, I give everybody the same color pen. My emphasis there is I don't care who's saying what. If you're in this room, you're in this room because your opinion's valuable, your input's valuable. So it's not important to me who's saying it. And usually I'll just sit back and watch that. One of the things I'm watching, if I'm the decision maker, of course in consensus I wouldn't be the decision maker, that'd be the group. But if I'm using a participative style, one of the things I'm look for is, are there a lot of fractions in that group, or am I seeing kind of common ideas? And I can look at that by just looking at come to the answers that they're writing, or some of the discussion that might have occurred up in step 2. But because if I'm seeing a lot of division at that point, one of the things I've learned in my corporate career is that's probably going to carry over to implementation. If I'm not getting people seeing things on the same page during steps 2 and 3, I'm probably not going to be on the same page when we go to implement, and that could create problems even with a good decision. So I may slow down, take more time. I think the key to your answer is doing a great amount of listening and very little talking. Great question, though. And consensus is tough. And when you walk through the Vroom tree, you'll find that the criteria to use consensus is a very tight criteria. There's got to be a number of appropriate factors in place, or the Vroom model, in terms of styles, is never going to take you to a consensus style. I just added a quick chalkboard here that coming out of step 3, that I find that one of the biggest pitfalls in decision making is not creating enough answers. I don't know what not enough is, but I would generally look for one or two, more than one or two. We always know that plan A during implementation may fail. We need to go back to a plan 2. Well, if I'm implementing and I'm failing, something's not implementing well, I may go back to step 3 and say, what other answers came out that we didn't consider that maybe we should have. So whatever you do in step 3, you want to create an environment that you get as many relevant answers. And when I say relevant, I mean relevant to the objectives and relevant to the question as you can, from as many people that you think that input's worthwhile, or they're going to be impacted by the decision, or going to be involved in implementing it. And generally what we find is, if you've involved people that way, even though they may not agree with the decision you make, they're more likely to help implement it when they know they were involved in the decision-making process, because they see the process as fair. There wasn't hidden agendas here. And I go back to the earlier question on consensus. I've seen consensus used where there's clear hidden agendas, and it doesn't take usually a rocket scientist to realize that there's hidden agendas playing out, and this consensus thing is just a white sheet over somebody trying to think they got me involved in the decision when it sounds like they've already made their minds up.
We've got one participant looking for clarification on the name of the decision-making model you've been talking about.
It's commonly referred to, if you do a Google search, as the Vroom, VROOM, Yetton, Yetton. Yetton was a graduate student that worked for Dr. Vroom, and there's a couple iterations of the model, but easily a Google search you'll find. Dr. Vroom's known for 2 models, an expectancy model and a decision-making model, and the one I'm referring to here is decision-making. I'm sure just put Vroom plus decision-making in Google, and you'll find all kinds of connection to that model. Been very much written about it. Interesting, in a lot of business books on decision making, you don't hear a lot about Dr. Vroom's work, but I found he's one of the most practical research decision making guys in the academic area. Like I said, over 55,000 managers he's worked with. He's presented to the top leadership at General Electric at their Jack Welch Leadership Center in New York. Very, very well respected. Just didn't come out and write a whole lot of business books about what he did, but you'll find a lot of good articles, and most of them aren't very academic in terms of terminology. You'll be able to read through them and understand them. Good question. So step 3, we kind of talked about techniques, brain writing, brainstorming. Brain writing is just brainstorming, but instead of having people speak out loud, we're actually having them generate their ideas on Post-it notes. I find it's a lot safer environment for people to get their information out. Sometimes when we brainstorm, people will mention something and other people will start to say, nah, that won't work, or they'll start shooting ideas down and answers, and I don't want to do that. So I want to try to get information from everybody in that room, and I've just found the technique of brain writing versus brainstorming to be better. And that's basically the technique in step 3. You're just trying to get answers out. Step 4 is it's time to evaluate those and make the decision. And in any of the first 3 styles, remember, one person's making the decision. So that would be where that person comes in back into play to evaluate what came out of step 3. There may be additional information that as a manager or a leader they are privy to that maybe the group wasn't privy to, and that happens sometimes. So they'll do some evaluation and make the decision. If it's a consensus decision-making style, well, the group's coming over into step 4, and they're going to be involved in evaluating the alternatives or the answers in step 3 and making a decision as a group. And again, you may take some straw votes to find out where people are at, but at the end, it's got to be a consensus, which is unanimous to support one way or support another way in the decision. This is where we'll factor in risk analysis. Risk and reward gets factored in. Skill level of employees that are going to be needed to implement the decision, operational systems that may need to be in place before the decision can be made and implemented. So it's a step that sometimes can be very obvious based on what's come out of step 3, and sometimes it's a step that requires a little bit of effort. So the first 4 steps take us up to making the decision. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people would say, well, isn't the decision-making process over at this point? The decision has been made. But as all of you that have taken vacations this summer know, once the decision's made on where you go, you still have a lot of work to do before you get there. A technique that I mentioned in the class that I found very helpful is also comes from the Harvard Business Review. Jack Welch's wife now, Susie Welch, used to be the editor of the Harvard Business Review. She's written a whole book on this topic, believe it or not. It's just called the 10-10-10. And what it does is it gives you a chance to put some perspective on your decision before you make it. And this is to avoid some of the traps and some of the System 1. Remember, System 1 is very quick. System 1 doesn't like to think long term. That is not even really capable of thinking long term. So this technique, I like it because it can help blend that System 1 and System 2. So right when you get ready to make a decision, just ask yourself, how good will I feel about this 10 minutes from now? There's no magic to 10 weeks. It could be 10 days. 10 weeks could be 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years. I think it's hard to focus out on 10 years these days in decision making, but it just gives you a chance to put a spotlight on 3 different perspectives of time and ask, would I be as happy with this decision 10 weeks from now as I would be 10 minutes from now? And again, anytime you get a chance to move that spotlight or take a long-term perspective on a decision, it's a chance to blend System 1 and System 2 together and avoid some of those bias traps that are so common. So I throw this question out to you guys, but I think maybe I've already answered it. What decision-making traps could 10-10 help you avoid? So we talked about short-term emotion, I think would be an obvious one. Anchoring, where you put too much emphasis on the first information you receive. Definitely confirmation bias and overconfidence traps can be helped by 10-10-10. I think there's a lot of great leaders out there that use this technique when they're making decisions. And I mean, you could modify it to 3-3-3 or 5-5-5 if 10-10-10 seems like too long of a time frame. So again, I want to go back to that definition again. A choice that you or with the help of others make about something, that would take us all the way up to step 4. But note what I put in red here, that results in a course of action taken. And I think you have to include implementation and evaluation as a legitimate part of any decision-making process. It's not a separate process. It's part of the original process. So we've got to put an action plan together. How are we going to implement the decision? Generally, at that point, I'll bring the people back in that maybe participated in the decision that gave me input, let them know what decisions made, give them a chance to give me some input on that. And at that point, say, we need to move on to what actions need to be taken. Who's going to be doing what? How long is it going to take? What do we need to do to put this decision into play? We have metrics already established at step 2, so we'll probably put some tracking mechanisms in place at this point. Dan and Chip Heath, I think their last name is Heath. Those of you, Dan and Chip Heath, have written a great book called Decisive that came out a few years ago, one of the best books on decision making that I've read. They talk about setting up tripwires during implementation. A point where you go so far and acknowledge that if we get to that point and the decision's not yielding what we said in step 2 that we wanted it to yield, then we need to step back and decide what's going on and not just keep pressing or digging the hole deeper or pressing the decision. It's probably clear at that point we haven't made a good one, where this plan's not working for some reason, and we need to go back and look at a plan B or discuss why implementation's not working. But another book that I highly recommend called Decisive by Dan and Chip Heath, which have written a number of other great books. But they talk about the need to emphasize implementation as part of the decision-making process. And then finally, while we're implementing, obviously we're probably in real time assessing results, and at some point we have to say, did we achieve what we said in step 2 we were going to achieve? And some of those may be short-term and some of them may be long-term. I've been in some corporate decisions where it would take up to a year or 2 to really evaluate if that decision went well or not. So keep that in mind, depending on the type of decision. I've made some other decisions where within 5 minutes you'd be able to assess if the decision went well or not. So I think the emphasis there is you've got to keep tracking the decision until you see what you put in step 2 ultimately achieved, and not just walk away. One of the tools I personally have used in my own career is I tend to journal key decisions. And I walk through in my journal these steps, and I'm not, by the way, a disciplined journaler, so it's not easy for me to do. But I've learned if I can journal through these steps, if the decision doesn't go well, I now have ability to go back and look at the steps that I did and maybe see where I made a mistake or made a flaw or a bias stepped in or I brought too much intuition in and not enough analytical. So I would highly recommend that on key decisions you make in your career that you consider journaling and journaling through the steps of a process. And of course, the other advantage of journaling is it allows you to remind yourself you need to continue to track the results to make sure the results are being achieved. In a lot of business decisions we make these days, it's 2 or 3 years out to sometimes you can really measure. You can consider an acquisition, 2 companies acquiring each other. It's going to take years for people to really assess that decision. Big strategic decisions tend to take a period of time to assess. Just added, I think the decision maker must be accountable for monitoring the quality of the decision. That's monitoring your step 2 objectives all the way through implementation and even when implementation's over to make sure that they're being achieved. Do we have any more polling questions, Greg?
Nope, that concludes that, and I don't believe we have any additional questions that have come in. So thank you, Bob. We certainly appreciate you joining us today and sharing your knowledge on decision making with us. For those of you online, thank you for joining us as well. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into decision making, we encourage you to register for Bob's public program on October 24th at the Educational Service Center of Cuyahoga County, located in Independence, Ohio. And you can see the link there on your screen. We also encourage you to register for our next webinar, Powerful Business Writing, with Kent State facilitator Marianne Canario, and that is at 10 a.m. on Friday, August 24th. If you'd like to learn more about making great decisions or any of our program offerings, please contact us at 330-672-3416 or email us at yourtrainingpartner@kent.edu. So this concludes our time together this afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.